to Cara all about her health journey and what it's like to find out you need to have a heart transplant. Now, we did have some audio issues for this episode, so I apologize in advance for any sound issues during the episode, but I hope you enjoy. Thank you for coming on.
That's all right. Thank you for having me. It's pretty cool what you're doing. I like the idea. It's really, really cool.
Can you just start by giving us some background on you?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Cara. I'm 38 years old, and when I was born with a pretty complex, and at the time in 1984, it was quite rare, congenital heart disease or condition, which they diagnosed at the time as pulmonary atresia with other complications. Basically, I had no outlet on the right side of my heart. So I was called what they used to call a blue baby. And following that, I had my first heart surgery at 3 days old. I then had my second heart surgery at 6 days old. And then my parents were basically told, what Cara's got is quite rare. We've never really quite come across it before. We don't believe that she is going to live very long. So basically take her home, enjoy her while you've got her, because we don't think she'll, it'll be a miracle if she sort of survives past the age of 6. And then about 6 months after that, my mum was actually got a call. I think she said it was like a Friday night, and it was one of the professors that I was under. And he said to Mum, I've just come back from America and I think I've seen a surgery that could work for Cara. However, it's never been performed in Australia before, and it's never been performed on a newborn. So there's no guarantees that it would work, and Mum said, how do I make that decision? What would you do? And he said, if I was you, Mrs. Curan, I would go ahead with the surgery, because if you don't, you're going to lose her. However, if we do this surgery and it's successful, I don't know how much more time you have with Cara, but you'll have, extra time. So Mum said her very words were, well, I don't have a choice then, let's do it. And so I had surgery at 6 months old, and then I just thrived after that. We had moved from Sydney to Coffs Harbour, and I was pretty blessed. I lived a pretty normal childhood. I was in every sport. It didn't really stop me from doing anything. Growing up, I just thought I had a scar and I was sick when I was a baby. I didn't actually grasp the severity of it. And I just knew every year we would go down to Sydney to Prince of Wales Hospital for a checkup. And every checkup, my cardiologist at the time would say to Mum and Dad, I don't know what you're doing, but keep on doing it, because we actually can't explain why she's going so well. And I often credit my parents for how they raised me as to why I survived as long as I have, because I was never raised to think I was a sick person. I wasn't really stopped from doing anything. They were careful in a sense, like when growing up, I remember I had 2 rules or things that Mum would say. If my lips and my fingers were purple or blue and I wasn't cold, to tell somebody, and if I felt breathless or tired. But yeah, so that was how my entry into the world started and my childhood. So when I was 21, in that time, I'd moved from my home on the north coast in Coffs Harbour down to Sydney because, I was young and didn't want to live in a small town, wanted to do the big city thing. And I had my first proper job, and I was young. I just moved to the city. I was working full time for the first time in my life, and I literally just had been burning the candle at both ends. And because I started to get really tired and my health went downhill a bit. And it sounds so silly because I remember at the time I didn't even put it down to my heart. I literally just thought I'd been, burning candle to both ends. And when they had a look, basically the surgery they did when I was 6 months old, they basically man-made a pulmonary valve, and thinking because they used my own tissue, it would grow. But obviously it didn't. So I actually, well, it wasn't even a proper valve anymore. It was so worn out. But I actually still had the valve of a 6-month-old. So when I was 21, I had my fourth open heart surgery, and I was given a brand new pulmonary valve. And that gave me a new lease on life because obviously I'd never had a working valve, and now I did. So after that, I just grabbed life by the horns and I started traveling and just, getting back into life and doing all that.
And then when did you start getting sick again?
Yeah, so I went really well, and like I said, because I'd never had a proper working valve, it was like the best I'd ever felt. I'd never had so much energy, and it was so probably about 2016. We actually were overseas. We'd just finished backpacking Southeast Asia, and my partner, Pav, he is from the Czech Republic. So we'd actually were staying with his family. And I started to notice a few things. And again, sounds so silly and naive. I didn't put it down to my heart. I just thought because we'd been backpacking and, living that sort of lifestyle, I was just worn myself out a bit. And there was this moment we were going for a bike ride in his little hometown, and it was all flat surface, and I couldn't ride very far, and I started to get really breathless. So I sort of started to think maybe something's going on here, but I knew that I had a cardiologist appointment coming up when we got back to Australia. So I just put it off for a couple of months and didn't really, think too much about it. And then at the end of 2016, we'd moved back to Australia by that time, and I had my checkup. And in that time frame, a few other things I started to notice. Like I started to get a little bit of fluttering heartbeats, which is called AFib, and just tired, no energy. And I had my regular checkup, and my cardiologist at the time said, yes, there's been some change. And then that's when we found out that I needed another surgery, and basically said that because my heart had been overworking and probably overcompensating for that valve, there was other parts of my heart on the right side had started to stop working effectively. So in January of 2017, we went ahead with my 5th heart surgery at Westmead, and that was quite a big surgery. That was probably one of the biggest surgeries I've ever had. So with that surgery, I had a pulmonary and aortic valve replacement. I had what they also called a bidirectional Glenn shunt. So basically they rerouted my blue blood to go, rather than go how everybody else is, goes round the heart and then to your lungs. They rerouted it so it goes straight to my lungs. And the idea of that was to try and take pressure off the right side. They also anticipated that maybe later on, when I was a bit older, I might need a pacemaker, but because they did that bidirectional Glen shunt, they had to put in the pacing wires before they did that, because once they rerouted and sort of changed my plumbing, they wouldn't be able to get the pacing wires in. So I currently still have pacing wires, but no pacemaker. And yeah, so that was quite a big operation, and I knew pretty much straight away, because I had the surgery when I was 21 to go off. I knew pretty much straight away as soon as I came out of ICU that I just didn't, something wasn't right. Like, I just didn't feel. And they were quite happy with the surgery, and they seemed to think that it might have just been anxiety, and it was because it was such a big operation. They said, it's going to take a little bit longer to recover, and you're a bit older now. So, because when I had that one, I was in my early 30s, whereas the operation I had which was number 4, I was like 21. So, you listen to the doctors, but I had a pretty horrific recovery. I didn't actually ever fully recover. I was air ambulanced from Coffs Harbour a couple of times back to Sydney. I couldn't keep anything down. I just felt genuinely unwell all over. But they were doing all these tests, and they just kept saying, I think you've just got a bit of anxiety, everything's fine. And yeah, so that was quite traumatic for me, I guess, because, you have all these people saying you're fine, but you don't feel well. And then because you have all these, people in the medical world saying, no, everything's fine, there's nothing wrong, I think you just need to, like, maybe go get some help because you might have what they call the cardiac blues, which is sort of like post-surgery depression that they talk about. And because of that, obviously, my family then started to be like, well, they've said there's nothing wrong. So it was quite traumatic for me, because I'd never had mental health issues before. And then I started to get really bad anxiety, panic attacks, PTSD, because I thought, oh my God, I'm going crazy. There's nothing wrong with me. And I just tried to compensate and just tried to think, okay, well, maybe this is my new normal. And that went on, so from January 2017, and then I sort of plateaued and was okay, but not 100%, around June of 2017. And I just thought, oh, well, this is my new normal. So me and my partner in that time moved to the Gold Coast. I re-entered the workforce and started working full-time again. And I went okay for 6 months. And then in December of 2017, I started to really go downhill again, where I couldn't keep anything down. I was really sick, like just felt unwell. I had quite a few hospital admissions and trips to the emergency department at 2 hospitals on the Gold Coast. I think I had 1 or 2 ambulance rides, and that went on till about April of 2018. And I remember there was a period of a week where I started taking photos of my stomach, because I actually couldn't keep anything down, but I looked like I was 9 months pregnant, like I had a really swollen belly. And I ended up sending an email to my cardiologist in Sydney with the photos, and I said, I understand everybody keeps saying, there's the operation went well and there's nothing going on. But I said, I know my body. I said, something's not right. And he said, I want to get you in to have a checkup. I can either get you down to Sydney, or I have a work colleague who also specialises in adults with congenital heart disease that works out of Brisbane. So because we were living on the Gold Coast at the time, I said, I'll just go to Brisbane. And so the next week I had an appointment booked, and we went up, and thank goodness for this man, because without him I actually don't think I would be here talking to you today. He took one look at me and said, I think you're in heart failure. He drained 2.5 to 3 litres of fluid and excess blood and yuck stuff that had not been pumped properly over the past, 14 months, that had been pooling in my abdomen and my liver. Due to that, and then I had a bunch of other tests, and due to that, he said that I also had quite bad liver damage. I had what they called medically induced cirrhosis. And then as soon as he drained the fluid, and he put me on a fluid restriction and some fluid tablets, I felt 100% better. And he booked me in for a cardiac cath, a right heart cath, which is where they basically, it's a little tiny camera where they either make an incision in your neck, or they make an incision in your groin and put it up through, and they measure the pressures of your heart. So I had that scheduled, and when I had that, that's when we found out that the operation actually hadn't worked how they thought, and I'd actually gone into end-stage heart failure, and I had early signs of liver failure. And that was when we first heard the word transplant. He said to my mum, who was with me at the time, and me, he said, what Cara needs is a heart transplant. That I think we've done everything we can surgically. However, because it is such a high risk surgery and, such a big step, he said, what I want to do is try and slow the failure down a bit. And so he started me on some medication. And yeah, that's how we first heard the word transplant and sort of slowly entered into the transplant world.
And all the doctors, telling you that you're fine when you clearly feel like you're not fine. Has that caused any issues with you, any like medical PTSD or like mistrust of doctors?
Yes, and I get really frustrated because the medical system, the medical world and hospitals and all that has been such a routine part of my life and my family's life. That's one thing when I think about it, I get really upset and angry and frustrated because I never had an issue. It was so normal to me and such a routine part of my life that, I'd always had full trust and faith, and any hospital admission, I just breezed through it. I never gave it a second thought. And because of that, it's almost like a broken down relationship because the trust isn't there. But I'm someone that's going to need to have the medical world a part of my life for the rest of my life. And it's really hard. It did. It broke the trust got broken down. Like I said before, it caused me massive mental health issues because, it's really scary if you've never experienced mental health or anything like that. And it's really scary not being believed. because it also started to, there was times where I felt like I couldn't even go to my family or my partner because, and it's no fault of their own, because we had all these people who you're meant to have full trust in telling us, no, there's nothing wrong. So it had started to cause a little bit of, I don't want to say friction, but it was really hard because my family were getting frustrated and my partner, because, you know, I was so worked up. There was days when I was in the thick of it where, this was before we found out that, you know, there actually was something wrong. There were days where I would just beg my partner not to go to work. Like I couldn't be alone. Like it was just so scary. And it's been really triggering for me going onwards, because I get so triggered now when I feel like I'm not being heard. But now whenever I have any interaction or given any information, I'm always second guessing, because I'm like, So it is so extremely triggering, because, you know, it's just, nobody knows your own body like yourself. And I'm just, no, it's just really hard, especially for someone like you said, who, you know, I'm going to have faith in the medical world for the rest of my life. And you just got to try. I'm trying to get the trust back again, if that makes sense.
And then when did you start getting sick again or getting worse?
Obviously, when we had the cardio catheter, like I said, that was the first time we heard transplant mentioned. And so once the cardiologist and the cardiac team in Brisbane drained the fluid, and I was put on fluid restriction. At the time, it was a 2-liter fluid restriction. I was on fluid medication, a lot of cardiac meds, and it just stabilized me. So I was still unwell, but I was coping. I was able to work full time, but I would kind of go through highs and lows. So I'd go good for a couple of months, and then my health or my body, it was like, I think just because it's overworking, it'd just spaz out, and like for a couple of months I'd have a really low period where, you know, I wasn't able to function properly. And I just had to learn to adapt to that, which was quite hard for me. Condition had never stopped me from doing anything. And if it did, I was always pretty determined and would just push through. And so that I found challenging. Yeah, I would go on highs, then I'd go good for a couple of months, then I'd go bad for a couple of months. And in those years, every now and then I'd have a hospital admission for a week or two. And also during that time, when we found out that, you know, I needed a new heart, but we were going to be trialed on meds and try and slow this failure down, there was a lot of times it was quite hard and challenging mentally, because we were trying to process information, and the goalposts, so to speak, were forever changing. So when we found out that I was going to eventually need a heart, and that I was now in end-stage heart failure, because the team was so worried about, also focused on my heart, the way we got told a bit of information about pregnancy was so casual. It was just like, so in that time we actually got told, oh, and by the way, don't fall pregnant, it'll kill you, sort of thing. And I feel really silly and naive, because maybe I should have asked. Nobody in all my adult years had ever said that my heart could be an issue of me carrying a pregnancy. So to be told that when I was 35, whilst we've just been told you know, your heart's slowly failing and you're going to need a new one, it was really hard to process that along with the other things. I never realized my heart could have an effect on other areas of life, if that makes sense. So in a sense, it was quite challenging at times mentally, because we were trying to process this, and while we're trying to process this, then the goalposts move to over here, and it's like, oh, hang on, but we're still trying to, work through that. So that part of it had its ups and downs, and then I started to have a low couple of months last year, at the start of last year, and I had a checkup. As soon as I walked in, he took one look at me, and we both agreed, like I just said, I'm done. Like I need to know next steps, or we need to, like, I can't keep going on like this. And he agreed. He said, I'm going to refer you to the heart and lung team, transplant team down at St Vincent's Hospital in Sydney. He actually didn't think I was sick enough to be considered yet. He actually said, I actually don't think they'll list you, but let's just get them familiar with your case, because eventually you will be under them. Like a little weight had been lifted off my shoulders, because I was like, oh, okay, now we've got the next phase in progress, sort of thing. And about a month later, I had my first appointment with the team, and it happened to fall when the last bit of the heavy COVID lockdowns, and Sydney went into lockdown and all that. So I actually was quite negative about my upcoming appointment because of the COVID situation. They changed it from a face-to-face to not even it wasn't even a video, it was just going to be a phone call. And I thought at the time I was being so negative about it. So I was like, oh, this is like, how they've never met me before. Like, how are they going to, they don't even know my history. Like, I'm just one that has to, I deal better when I'm, face to face and in person. And I couldn't have been more wrong. My mum took the morning off, and so did my partner. And the professors rang, and she said, can I call you back in 20 minutes? I'm going through your case. It's quite complex and there's a lot of information to take in. And so we were like, yeah, sure. And again, I was like, thinking at the time, oh God, they're not prepared, blah, blah, blah. And again, I was proven wrong. So true to her word, she phoned back 20 minutes later. Within the first 5 minutes of that second call that she made, she started saying, all right, I'm emailing off a shopping, she called it my shopping list, and it was a list of tests that I had to do, and it was what we call work up to transplant. So you basically have to have every test imaginable, because with transplant, it's a little like, you have to be sick enough to need a transplant, but you also have to be healthy enough with your other areas of your body that you're going to survive the transplant. So she's like, I'm going to send you your shopping list. And she started going into the workup testing. And I said, oh, does this mean I'm eligible? And her very words were, oh, honey, you're more than eligible. And I remember thinking at the time, oh, gosh, because it sounded like I'd been eligible for quite a while. And it sounds so ridiculous because, although scary and, needing a whole new organ and one of your main organs, so heavy. And I almost felt elated because finally I was like, oh, we'd been working up to this moment for, 3.5 years or whatever it was. And it just sounds so silly, but it was almost like I was a little bit excited or happy. And it kind of stemmed from there.
So now that you're on the transplant list, you're basically just waiting for a phone call, right?
So it took, on the 24th of September last year, I was officially listed, and they discovered during my workup testing, so for the whole of my workup testing before I got listed, we had mentally prepared, and so did the team. They actually thought I was going to need a new heart and a new liver. And they said, because of that, it's complex, because we've actually never performed that type of transplant before. So that it was quite an anxious wait leading up to finding out if I was actually going to be listed, because there was a chance that it might have been too complex, that it was too risky, so I may not have been listed at all. So anyway, I got a call on the 24th of September to say that I was being officially listed, and it was just going to be the heart, because they said, what we think is once you get a proper working heart, your liver will rejuvenate itself. So that was quite happy and quite good. It sounds so ridiculous, but again, we were celebrating like, oh, just the heart, like. And again, I don't know whether it's blind optimism or I'm naive, but I got listed in September of last year, and I literally thought I was going to have had the transplant by Christmas and be recovered. Like, I had no idea. So they discovered, because of all my past surgeries, blood transfusions, and probably because I've had donor valves in the past, I have extremely high antibodies, and it's called being highly sensitized. So basically, they described it as it shrunk my donor pool right down, which is the reason why I've been waiting so long. So basically, regardless of rejection meds, if I get a heart from a certain tissue, my body will just reject it and attack the organ. So since September up until now, they have been discussing my case quite a lot, and they have been consulting with antibody specialists, and whilst I'm waiting, we're just in the process of trying to get lowering my antibodies so it can increase my chances. You don't realise how much goes into needing an organ. Like, I just thought you just have to match blood types and you get a heart. There's so much that goes into it. But as I hit the 12-month mark back in September 2022, I started to get quite down with it all. It's been quite challenging mentally the last couple of months, because, I think reality has set in a little bit. At the start, I never considered that there could be another outcome to all of this where I actually don't get a heart. And the longer that I wait, the more I'm deteriorating, the more that reality is actually hitting me. I'm still quite optimistic, and I'm still being positive, but it is hard. It's made me feel emotions that I don't really sometimes know how to navigate, and they're quite foreign to me. I've always been a very happy, go-lucky, positive, outgoing person who celebrates wins for everyone, loves celebrating wins for family and friends. And the longer the wait is, there's days where, you have so many emotions, you don't know how to process them. There's been times when I felt like such an awful person and so guilty because, people I've connected with and made friends with throughout this journey who are also waiting for hearts. They've all had their transplant, and I remember the first time I actually felt guilty for feeling how I felt was there was a friend who received a heart, and I'd met them through the same clinic. And I think because we were through the same clinic, it was like, oh, they're waiting as well. And I remember when I got the message to say that, they'd had their call, it was so hard because I'd never felt so happy for someone, but yet so angry. And it was really quite scary because there's just human nature. Like, you're like, why me? Like, why am I taking so long? And it's been hard sometimes to always remain positive when there's an end result.
Unfortunately, the last bit of the interview with Cara ended up being unusable, but I asked Cara what you can do to help someone who's on the transplant list. She said they can help by registering as an organ donor at donatelife.gov.au, and make sure you have the chat with your family, as they are ultimately the ones who will have the final say. So even if you're registered as an organ donor, they can still say no on your behalf. And to remember that the next person who may need the help of an organ donation could be your loved one. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. Don't forget to subscribe to get our episodes each week, and leave a review if you are enjoying the podcast. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter at Sigavit Podcast, and Instagram at Sigavit_podcast. I'll talk to you next week. Bye.